Okay, welcome to Solidarity Talks. I'm really honored to be here with Riel Dupuis-Rossi and Travis Heath to talk about Believed in Hope, or whatever else it is that we're going to come to talk about. I'm Vikki Reynolds, and I'm in the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh people in what gets understood as Vancouver, what gets called the nation state of Canada. Before we start, I just need to acknowledge what's happening in these territories and the genocide that's being revealed. So at over 6,000 children's bodies have been found in unmarked graves in residential schools in Canada. Only a very small number of schools have been looked at, and there's over 100 schools. So this number isn't a true reflection of how many children have died. And I want to center though Indigenous communities' resistance and struggle and the work communities, Indigenous communities are doing to care for these murdered children, to bring their remains home, to do this in a ceremonial and a good way, and to center Indigenous responses to this as opposed to settler pain or guilt or any of that stuff. And just think we need to reflect for a moment on this genocide that's happened by the nation state of Canada and all of us who are settler people. Thanks for taking time. I think we have to arrest ourselves and address this. I'm really honored today to be with Travis and Riel. So I turned 60 this year, and lots of people have been asking me across my career how I'm still alive in the work and how I'm not burned out or vicariously traumatized or something because of the nature of the work that I do, because I've worked with people on death row, because I work at survivor torture centers, rape crisis centers, responding to the opiate catastrophe and death, you know. We wrote an article called, I don't even know the name of it. We wrote an article called Inspiring Believed in Hope as an Ethical Position, Vicarious Resistance and Justice Doing. But I couldn't write this alone. And I just felt that, so very much it's the most personal thing that I've ever written. It's kind of like, here's my path to this. And I also think it's the last thing that I'll probably write. Certainly, I don't have plans to write anymore. I think this is it for me. And, but I also felt like, especially as a white settler person and a straight person, I just didn't want to write alone. So I invited Travis and Riel to come and co-author, but we didn't want to write it together in one voice because we don't agree on anything or everything. We don't have one path to this. And so I was really, really appreciative for both of you to accept my invitation to read the paper, to offer me a really honest critique. Like, you're both in my solidarity team because I know you have the moral courage to actually offer a real critique. And I thought that what both of you wrote was so expansive, and it actually created for me like an ethical container that my voice could sit in without being so centered and alone. I just felt really accompanied by both of you. Ken Gergen, when I did my PhD, talked about, one of the things he said to me is, you have a lot of textual allies. I was like, yeah, I do. And I think of you that way. And I, like Travis, your writings and your teachings have mattered in our relationships, right? And so, yeah. So, and Riel, the conversations, the dialogues you created as transformation talks and had me in with, those things have all really mattered. So I just really wanted to write with the two of you, but more in keeping our important differences, right? So anyway, so I'm really thrilled to be here with Travis Heath and Riel Dupuis-Rossi. If you both want to just locate yourself in the work and in this conversation, I guess.
Go for it, Travis. I'll go after you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Travis. I'm a cisgender man, pronouns he, him. To locate my ancestry, my birth father was originally from Brazil, what's called Pardo. So that means of African descent, Brazilian Indigenous, and European descent. and my birth mother was of European descent, so Polish and German. I was adopted by two white parents when I was young, like 8 weeks old or whatever the hell they said you were supposed to do adoptions at that time. In terms of locating myself a bit professionally, I'm a licensed psychologist in terms of my formal training and like what the state would call me. I don't know what I am in terms of the work I do. I don't have a good word to describe it. I hope it's not just a psychologist. I think a lot of times the work I'm involved with people has some form of healing involved with it. I don't know that word fits for everyone, but it's the best word I can find to describe the type of work. Also, I would say that often the work has some sort of, I'll borrow a phrase of yours, Vikki, some sort of justice doing within the work. At least I hope it does, because otherwise it's really not work. Like, what are we doing? Narrative therapy is something that's influenced the work that I do substantially, although I have I've come across narrative therapists who call me not a real narrative therapist, which I take as a compliment, by the way, whatever that means. So, but certainly narrative ideas have been interesting to me in terms of the work that I do. And, I also work as a university professor, which that's complicated in its own right. I won't get too much into that, but I think it's important that people know that is part of the professional identity. And I just want to say really quickly, thanks for like hearing you say it's the last thing I'll ever write. You said that when we spoke to Dulwich in Australia as well. I don't remember, a couple of months ago or whatever it was. And I remember feeling honored that I would be asked to be a part of any of the writing, that we were involved with here. But to hear it was like the last piece of writing that you might do, I thought, like, damn, that feels like a little bit of pressure. Like, I hope what I wrote does that some measure of justice. But no, it's awesome to be here, and like, it's really cool to, be a part of this little team. And it's probably the most unique piece of writing that I've been involved with, which is cool, because I get bored easy, and I'm really interested in finding ways to depart from like the academic ways of writing and thinking. And I hope we were able to do that, at least in some ways, with this. So yeah, it's awesome to be a part of all of that.
Thanks, Trav.
Niawagoa, I just want to begin by acknowledging the territories that I'm on. I'm meeting with Vikki and Travis today on the unceded and occupied homelands of the Coast Salish Nation and hosts, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. It's an honor to do decolonizing work, as I see it, as a Indigenous therapist on these territories. So I give great thanks, and also just want to acknowledge the profound impacts of hundreds of years of genocidal violence to which our nations across Great Turtle Island have been subjected to, and to honor our host nations for their commitment and dedication to maintaining those sacred roles that were given to us as Indigenous people in our homelands across Great Turtle Island, and to also acknowledge that all of Great Turtle Island is unceded and occupied territories, and to honor the diverse nations across Great Turtle Island for continuing to do the work of honoring all of our relations in our territories and maintaining those sacred roles handed down to us by Great Spirit of Creation, despite 500 years of ongoing genocidal attack. My name is Riel Dupuis-Rossi. I'm Kanien'kehá and Algonquin on my father's side. I'm Italian on my mother's side, and I grew up in my traditional territories off reserve in a place many now know as Hamilton, Ontario, and Montreal, Quebec. I've been working as a Indigenous trauma therapist, doing decolonizing and culturally centered work with individual Indigenous peoples here in Vancouver, Coast Salish territories. And it's been a great honor to do that. It's been a great honor to write with the both of you. So thank you for that. And I just want to do my best to speak to what Vikki introduced, how Vikki introduced. I can't sit with myself as an Ongwe person and not speak to this after a white settler has spoken to it. So I'm gonna dig down deep about, I just want to honor that our family members, our relatives who survived the residential school system have been sharing with us the horrors that they were subjected to and witnessed in their times at residential school, and shared with us the pain and the horror and the terror of seeing and witnessing the murders of their relatives, our relatives, children in the residential school. We have known for a very long time that this violence has been committed against Indigenous children, like this most horrific violence. And we have known about the unmarked graves told to us by those who went to residential schools who did make it home. I find it hard to find any English words to honor or to speak to this, and I'm just trying my best as Ongwe Honwe in our homelands. It's best that we speak about this. So I just want to honor the children who never made it home and who died in such horrific way. We hear that often these are the children who resisted not speaking the language, who tried to protect the other children, who refused to be disconnected from their siblings when they were being separated out by gender, who defended the two-spirit children who were in the residential schools who were being particularly attacked. And overall, just, you know, really in that warrior spirit and one way or another resisting what was happening and wanting to get back home. I want to honor the lives and the spirits and the hearts of every single child who has been found in those unmarked graves, and all the children who will be found in those unmarked graves, and all the residential school survivors who were courageous enough to find the words to tell us. I also want to acknowledge that the way that Canadian media has portrayed this has been violence unto itself, speaking in ways to our elders as they share in just such disrespectful ways that it just contributes to the horror. I think this is a pivotal moment to acknowledge that Canada is built on 500 years of ongoing attempted genocide against our people. And we are still here. We have been here since time immemorial, and we will continue to be here. But I want to honor what the Kanien'kehá, my people, speak of Canada as an illegal occupying force. And 500 years later, as this nation, the continuities of this nation building are, you know, Canada's been around for 150 years, but this nation building projects began 500 years ago is what I'm trying to say. I want to honor the warrior spirit that lives across all of Great Turtle Island to have the courage to acknowledge that despite this, the state of the world where nation states are, colonial settler nation states are normalized all over, that many of our people have the courage to say, no, Canada is illegitimate, illegal occupying force. And when we find out what has been done to Indigenous children with the unmarked graves and in so many other ways, stealing and attacking Indigenous children to establish this nation, it's important that more and more of us begin to heed that truth and begin to understand that Canada is established on genocidal violence. And I think that's the the best that I can say right now. But this is, yeah, Niawagua, all my relations. Thank you for allowing me the time to say what I have.
Thanks so much. Thanks for speaking your truth and trusting us with that. Really appreciate that. It's really cool that that Travis has also spoken about a decolonizing practice. And you have laid out, that understanding with you. I'm just thinking, Travis, do you want to say something about when you say decolonizing practice, what you mean something different and connected to what Riel is talking about? Do you want to can you say more about that? And I'm thinking like the work that you've done with Makungawak and Yala, but also I'm thinking of Ken Hardy's work and many other people that.
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity, Vikki. What I would say is that I need to back up in time to provide proper context. Like as a student of, like clinical psychology, what I was being taught in terms of what they called multicultural counseling or multicultural therapy didn't fit. I couldn't tell you why when I was a student, other than it was a felt sense, like something was off, this is not right. But of course, in academia, that you can't say that, like you have to articulate some kind of critique, right? And it took me quite a few years, and Makungawak and Yala, who you mentioned, his work was instrumental in this for me. But, eventually I came to understand psychology and clinical psychology and go on down the line, social work, counseling, the whole thing, was based on Eurocentric ideas. And that this thing that they were calling multicultural counseling was really saying something like, hey, those of you of non-European descent, or even if we want to go further, those of you who may not fit normative descriptions of personhood, you can come heal in this Eurocentric normative way of healing, like you too are welcome. Which I suppose that's a nice gesture, but it doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense to me. It never did. And that's was at the crux of what I was experiencing, right? Was that, and I didn't know how to put words to it for years really, but that like, this wasn't made for me, this wasn't made for us. And yet it's being expressed as though it is. But really, multicultural counseling was made for white folks. It was made to help white folks feel okay about difference and so forth. So first I arrived there, and then it was kind of like, all right, but what next? And then Makungu wrote maybe 20 years ago about ideas of cultural democracy, right? Which, if we were to take that and summarize it quickly, it would be creating spaces for people to speak on behalf of their own healing, right? And this, for me, when I think about a decolonial act, like I don't think psychology or psychotherapy or whatever it is, I don't think it can be decolonized because it's a colonial structure. The infrastructure is colonial. But I do think that we can create an alternative space, if we want to call it that. I don't know what a healing space, I could use that phrase, maybe a space of justice doing. And that space can invite people to speak on behalf of their own healing, and for communities to speak on behalf of their own healing. So when I think about decolonial work, that's at the core of it for me. And, it's a rather arrogant position to hold that somehow healing or real healing or modern or advanced healing, whatever language wants to get used, like that's only been around for 100 years or something. How long has psychiatry, psychology, et cetera, been around? I mean, it's sort of ridiculous to think that healing practices didn't exist before this. And by the way, a lot of the healing practices that are touted today, of course, are co-opted from practices of Indigenous peoples anyway. But to circle back to kind of put a close to when you ask me about decolonial practice, for me, it's really about creating spaces where people can speak on behalf of their own healing without feeling forced to conform to normative descriptions of how people should be. Now, does that decolonize psychology or psychiatry? No, I don't think it does. So maybe what's really happening is we're creating something different that we don't. I don't have the words to describe necessarily what that is. But sometimes people I work with do, right? They can say the process we're engaging in is, and that's great. That's what I'm hoping for, right? Is that it becomes some sort of co-created practice that serves the person or people that I'm working with within, in a way that's culturally near, right? That makes sense to them within their own lived experiences.
I'm thinking too, thanks so much for that, Travis. I'm also thinking about what Ken Hardy speaks about, a Black psychotherapist and great teacher from the United States. Talks about the soul wound, that therapy has to address the soul wound. And thinking about, certainly in the United States, about anti-Black racism and slavery being the building of capitalism that's set on top of the, and I love your language of that, Riel, attempted and ongoing genocide of Indigenous people in Turtle Island, then the other, the layers like the soul wound of anti-Black racism. And that's been, those voices have been so unwelcome in psychotherapy.
Yes, psychotherapy is the mind, right? It's so much as the mind and the brain, and it largely ignores the soul. What about the folks who come to us for soul healing, right? It's not a cognitive exercise, but that's largely what, and not only is it a cognitive exercise now, but it's a manualized one. It's a prescriptive one. Like, you might as well take people and put them on a conveyor belt and, I'm going to sort of systematically fix your minds, which I think a decent number of people I've worked with over the years aren't interested in having their minds or brains addressed. They're interested in having their hearts and souls addressed.
Beautiful. Riel, I'm thinking about in this article on Believed-in Hope. Is it okay if I read a little bit about what you wrote? So this is Riel's voice. My hope is born of reclamation, the subtle yet powerful act of reclaiming one's right to love as an Indigenous person, and those acts of greater magnitude, which include our community's defense of our land. These acts, whether they be deeply intimate or greatly political, are the equivalent of moving mountains and changing tides. I see Indigenous people's courage in this respect, and this courage unfolds on a moment-to-moment basis. Really talk that sinks. I'm just wondering if you want to reflect more on that or where that came from.
It came from, I think, my own, as an Indigenous therapist, showing up for our people required me to dig down deep and heal my own soul wound as Ongwe in our homelands. And for me, that was most generationally recently with the residential school and how my family has been profoundly impacted by residential school, working with Indigenous clients, so to speak, people who come for healing, required me to take a look at my own wounds so that I could show up in a way that had integrity as people opened up the impacts of colonization on their hearts and spirits and minds and bodies and relationships. And I came to witness that in the work and in my own healing work, that a commonality was, yes, we speak a lot about our homelands being occupied and unceded, but particularly with the residential school and the reservation system and all the different forms of colonial violence, I came to realize that our loved ones and our relationships and ourselves also have been occupied and unceded. That what happens, that genocidal violence is also often spoken about, with reference to UN declarations or really kind of macro level political implications around nation and territories. but the way that the deterritorialization and the attempted genocide it gets executed, and the mechanisms of that are very personal, you know, stealing children and breaking apart families and forcing different governmental systems that are not our own, that every single level of our relationality was under attack. And that's how settler colonial governments achieve more greater political ends, like deterritorialization is through intimate forms of violence. So I just felt it important to name that, you know, that, and by extension, our resistance as Indigenous people also occurs on all these levels. It occurs on very personal, intimate, relational levels of the heart and the spirit. And that is directly connected to our defense of our territories, you know, and our these monumental actions of resistance against colonization.
I'm just thinking right now of the people in Wet'suwet'en, Indigenous people in Wet'suwet'en who are land defenders, the tiny house warriors, that I think our trauma and resistance workshop is gonna, we're gonna donate some money to them. And I'm also thinking about all the Indigenous people and allies resisting the cutting of old growth forest that's happening right now at Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island, and just thinking about that, the thread between, I think, all of us, certainly what you wrote, Riel, and what you wrote, Travis, is these sites of resistance. You know, that some of our believed in hope is just in this continued, ongoing, always present resistance, right? I thought that was really lovely. Can I just read some other words that I just thought there was a fierce voice here. And we were saying when we were talking amongst ourselves, like, we didn't have to edit this paper much. And I was shocked because, not shocked, I was really proud of the publishers, you know, but that there's a fierce voice that is often, you know, academia doesn't want that, it regulates you and it silences you, and there's the erasure of a fierce politics. So I just wanted to read this other piece. So one of the things that you had said in the article, Riel, was that your hope lies in the possibility that one day settlers will turn their gaze with all its unconscious abuse of power away from us Indigenous people, begin to take a hard look at themselves. My hope lies in the possibility that one day settler may realize that their nation and their governments are illegitimate, that no amount of anti-oppressive practice will ever justify their existence. And when you were naming that, this is the language I think that really you spoke to. Even those who purport to practice anti-oppressive approaches often do not take the time to see us for who we truly are. The directionlessness of settler society, the poverty of capitalism, the emptiness of a market economy, the darkness of institutionalized settler religion, the incompetence of settler governments, all of these get projected onto us as Indigenous people. We're forced to bear the misery, the suffering, the poverty, and the criminality of colonial oppression. All of this stands in sharp contrast to the wisdom, wealth, and grace of our traditional governance structures. And it's here that I find my hope, and also truth, courage, integrity, strength, humility, reverence, and honor. I just thought that was really beautiful language.
Thank you. Yeah, we come from great peoples and great nations and great confederacies, and I take a lot of pride in knowing that since time immemorial, we've, as Onkwe, as Indigenous people in our own territories, been able to take care of the land and the forest and the water and the animals, and, you know, the winged ones and the ones that swim and the ones that walk and the ones that crawl, you know, that all of our relations are very loved and deeply cared for. And there's a profound peace that comes with that form of integrity. So I was speaking to that. And then also I think it's important to name, and I think Friends Fanon did some good work around this, like just, you know, there's all the different forms of violence that colonialism takes, and part of it is that violent power of projection, you know, like for us as these great peoples to be diminished in such a way by settlers who we ultimately assisted and supported and helped upon their arrival, like the profound betrayal of that. And then the projection, like if we're, you know, Travis is doing a great job of speaking in psychological terms and talking about the importance of decolonizing that psychology. And for me as an Indigenous person, when I'm sitting with Indigenous clients, quote unquote, the power and the brutality of that incessant projection, and yet the inaccuracy of it always stands. There's just such a starkness about it, but I feel it really important to name it because it often doesn't get named, and that form of racism circulates so incessantly and yet so widely every day, right? And even people who say they're anti-racist or they're Indigenous allies demonstrate such so much racism when it comes to that level of projecting onto us things that have nothing to do with us as Ongwe. So thank you for highlighting that, Vikki.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that. Travis, I'm wondering what you're thinking at this point about any of that, about like what Riel has written and how your work is connected and different.
Yeah, well, I just appreciate what's being centered right now, you know, because I think so often, anti-racism work, for example, if we want to use that term, anti-oppressive work, often the way that manifests is still by centering settler colonialism, right? By centering normative ways of being, right? If we want to even get more general. And so what I appreciate is what's being centered, and you know, like I'm thinking about what even transpired recently at the university when we talk about like anti-racist work, and it's like, well, that may not be work for me to do in the same way that it's work for the majority of people at the university to do, right? And yet it's centered. So when we're still centering white folks, and the intention is often good. I'm not saying the intention isn't good, but the execution reproduces the same set of processes. So as I'm listening to Riel and what they're saying, that's sort of what's coming to mind for me, is what are we centering and how are we centering it? You know, the American Psychological Association recently released an apology. That was, of course, after the American Psychiatric Association's apology and after whatever one of the psychiatric groups in Great Britain had issued apologies. And my thought about that was, okay, like an apology is probably necessary. However, if there's going to be an apology and what's going to go forward is just reproduce the same colonial logics that have been used, then what good is the apology really doing? You know, now I'll reserve judgment because I don't know. I can't predict the future. I don't know how things are going to go forward with this. But these things concern me because often the apologies are still centering colonialism, whiteness, etc. Right? And again, I don't know. Maybe the APA will do better this time, but if the past is any predictor of the future, then the same thing will happen. I'll just share one more thing as Riel's speaking that was brought up for me, which was, you know, thinking a little over a year ago, the protests around George Floyd's murder here in the United States. And there was a point in time where the protests became sort of popularized. And, you know, like the first couple, 3 weeks we were protesting, the police were shooting chemical weapons at us and so forth, which they deny, which is fine, but that's what they were doing. And then in a relatively short period of time, just a few weeks, I don't know, 3 weeks, something like that, people were showing up and taking selfies at the protests. And and there were thousands of people. And I was like, this has taken some kind of turn, You know, I don't know if it's a good turn or a bad turn necessarily. I'm skeptical of the turn it's taking, you know, and I was worried that it'd become performative. I mean, maybe it reaches a critical mass and that's good for the movement and the protest. I don't know. But I had this sort of visceral gut sense of this doesn't feel right. And now I look a year removed from this, I don't, like, it seems what's happening is that people are just going back to normal. Now, normal is an interesting word, I suppose, but whether it's with COVID or whether it's with racial injustices, people, it's like, well, we did that for a little bit. I just want to go back to normal, right? And that's quite a privilege to be able to go back to normal, because I don't know, like, if you're on the receiving end of, you know, continuing genocidal advances, genocidal violence, continuing racism, etc. I mean, I don't want to go back to that normal. Like that normal isn't, that normal's not for me. So I understand some people might want to because it's not comfortable for them. But I guess I'm bringing this up just to say that I worry that we go through these cycles where there's this performance and it's like, you know, I still worry about who's being centered in those performances, mind you, but you know, that, hey, there's all this momentum and energy, but then we sort of find ourselves back where we were before. And I'm not being a citizen of so-called Canada. I can't speak to this through any sort of lived experience, but you know, I worry with the Indigenous children that we're speaking about. I worry about the same thing's going to happen, right? Like, when I say it's going to happen, I guess I don't know for certain, but I feel like that's where it goes. And we just do this thing where it's like, well, what's enough? You know, well, hey, well, we put our flags at half mast for however long. All right, but like, what are we changing infrastructurally, right? What are we doing to address these things that are embedded in the damn system? You know, and instead, like, I've said this a lot lately, because it's really been pestering me, where it feels like racism is being treated as an individual attitude. And like, you know, maybe we should be less interested in hearts and minds, and we should be more interested in land, labor, and resources, right? And if we were to do that in some sort of sustainable way within our, I say we, I mean, if the you know, colonialist governments were to begin to do that in some sort of systematic and sustained way, maybe that would generate some sort of hope, but it doesn't. It feels like it plays out in a performative way. And then when you look at how the system's actually functioning, it's functioning in the same goddamn way that it was functioning before we started, or sometimes in ways that are even more covertly sinister, right? So like to me, when I hear Riel speaking, I go, okay, there's like a comfort in my soul about those words. And then that's in tension with the ways in which these governments and people in relative positions of power don't seem to really give a damn. They perform that they give a damn. Like in this country, United States, Joe Biden doesn't excite me. Joe Biden doesn't represent my interests. You know what I mean? Like, people were like, Joe Biden got elected, I should be excited. Bullshit, I should be excited. What he's doing is performing a little differently than Trump was performing. But in terms of policy, what the hell's the difference? In terms of the United States military industrial complex, what the hell is the difference? I mean, go on down the list, right? And I guess, so that's where the tension lies for me. There's a certain sense of comfort and connection in what Riel's saying for me personally. And then that's in tension with all these sort of systems that seem to reproduce the same colonial logic over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was getting at in that quote, Vikki. Thank you, Travis. It's reminding me of that moment I was writing, is that often I find anti-oppressive politics, loosely defined, often function just to reinforce the settler state, that it really stops at taking a look at settler violence and genocidal violence. And at that point where there could be some reflection around Canada being and the United States being illegal occupying force, it halts there and then just re-justifies itself, right? Yeah.
That's such a great word, rejustifies itself.
Mhm.
That's, I feel like that's a word I've been searching for and haven't been able to find. It rejustifies itself. Oh, that one hit.
Yeah, I think I just made it up, so just giving you a heads up at the moment.
Beautiful. It's beautiful and it's apt.
Thank you, Travis.
Yeah, and I like how you picked up how Riel, in their writing and speaking, are always centering Indigenous ways of being. And in your writing, I think that you've also tried to reclaim space from the margins, right? I think about Bell Hooks writing from margin to center. So and it also, like, yeah, in this paper, I love it. It speaks to what you just said about Joe Biden and the United States, and whatever that not representing you, talking about when you think about hope, just how that's constructed for people in the middle, which I think you just spoke to. But also, it's based on an idea of a republic and a constitution that was never created for me. Hope, just like so many other things, has been co-opted by the machine. How do we take it back? Is it time to blow it up and start all over again? How do we find hope we can believe in? Might hope be something we have to construct anew with each person and are in conversation with? And how does hope on the margins look different than hope in the middle? And then you've said a little bit further down this really beautiful phrase: people I've been in conversation with have taught me it takes a kind of fierce humility to locate and elevate the hope we find on the margins. And I love that. And I wonder, because you had said something really lovely about how this wasn't like a finished academic paper. This isn't the end of your thought. This is like a half-baked idea. You're pondering, you're inviting us in to puzzle with you. How might we bring back hope from the margins? How is hope on the margins different than hope in the middle? And that there's this fierce humility to locate and elevate that hope. Just maybe, yeah, that just got me excited. Maybe just say more about that.
I wish I had the answers to some of the questions that you were reading there. I don't feel like I'm smart enough to find answers to those questions, but I guess maybe that's part of what troubles me too, is that the way knowledge creation is understood within dominant culture is that there will be an answer, and we will have the answer. And I don't. To me, I think the answers they shape shift, right? What suits us in one moment may not always be what we need in another moment, and so I want to try to resist the urge to just answer those questions, but maybe the process of going through that is what's most useful. But yeah, in terms of like hope on the margins, I feel like I'm reflecting on working with people involved in the criminal injustice system in the United States, and there's hope there. There's lots of hope there, but it's stifled at every turn. So it's like the probation system says, well, we want you to go get a job and live a good life, and we don't. Okay, like those are the words, but the way the system functions is like, we're actually expecting you to recidivate, right? We're expecting the same thing to happen again. And when it does, we're going to blame you. And we're going to blame the ways in which you didn't take personal responsibility. Yeah. And so that hope on the margins, like if we're not careful, it gets stifled by the way hope is constructed in the center, right? And even that, like, it's so interesting to me, like the probation systems are, like having a job is so central to that. Now, the idea that we, in some ways, want to provide for our families and our communities, right? That part, I get that, but that's not what's being. It's like you are morally inferior if you can't get a job, and depending on the type of job you have, that like determines your moral worth as a human being, right? And that to me is the way, one small way that hope begins to be defined in the center. Like if you don't engage in these capitalist games in the right way, you are a morally inferior person. And if you're a person who exists on the margins and you're trying to find hope the way it's stored in the center, it's just constantly going to make you feel as though you're inferior and you can't do it. And you know what? In too many cases, it's going to steal people's will to keep living and keep going, because it's like the thing is people, it's not that they can't play that game, it's that they don't want to. It offends their soul to try and play that sort of game, right? And so then once we can understand that and we can get rid of that bullshit and we can excuse it from our conversations, not that excuse it from existence because it still exists, right? But we can excuse it from our conversation. Now we can start to find hope that exists on the margins, right? Where, and when you start doing that, you know, like what I've started doing is writing letters to probation officers about the people I'm seeing, right? With their consent, of course. And really I'm using their language. And the probation officers, who I don't blame themselves, they're part of this probation system and they're told to behave in certain ways. But they're shocked about the person that I know versus the person that they know, right? Because there are all these aspects of the person and where they come from, their community, their hopes and dreams. When you start to hear about that, that is hope promoting. But the first question the probation officer often asks is, how have you not broken the law since I've last seen you?
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't promote any fucking hope, right? I mean, what that does is it basically says your worth as a person is whether or not you're following these prescribed laws. And so I think, anyway, when we can start to excuse some of those things and not story and see hope through those lenses, it opens up possibilities, right?
Well, you got me thinking about the story you wrote about Julio, right? Who started to be like in a desperate struggle to stay on the planet. And through that dialogue that you had him, which was obviously hope promoting, as you said there, he comes up with this beautiful line saying, I started to feel like there was hope for me again. I thought, maybe I can live this life. And I was thinking about the connection of a believed in hope with finding worlds that are worth living in.
Yes, and maybe even co-creating worlds that feel worth living in. And that might mean resisting the worlds that we're a part of now, right? Which people don't take to that too kindly. I mean, you're supposed to follow the sort of dominant normative script. But with, I would say, most of the people I'm in conversation with, if we follow that script, and I don't mean to be over dramatic here, in a number of cases, it will lead to their death. If we continue to adhere to that script and judge their sort of standing as a moral person in the world, it will lead to their death because it's just a game that is rigged against them, right? But if we depart from that, then there's all kinds of, I remember Julio saying that exact line. I'm glad you reminded me of that. Like, maybe there's hope for me, and in this world, to what we were speaking about earlier, the places that we've come from, the peoples that we've come from, have fostered hope long before now, right? Like there were ways of creating and sustaining and maintaining hope. It's just that looked very different than the way that we're supposed to do it now, right? Which, by the way, even for those in the dominant culture, it often doesn't promote hope for them either. They say, well, I got the 3 houses and the sports cars and the whatever, the 2.5 kids and the dog and the cat and the whatever the fuck you're supposed to have. They're miserable too, even within this. So I think that's where, it's this fine line of interrogating the systems and critiquing them. If we do that, I don't think that's enough, at least for the work I'm involved in. We also have to create a new systems of hope, right? Like co-create those with people or invite them to reclaim, perhaps. It's not always creating anew, sometimes it's reclaiming those systems of hope. Like, we need both. There's a lot of critique going on right now, and I think that's great. I'm not against that. I'm actually for it and part of that movement to critique. But if we, in the work that we do, if we just do that and we don't create, help create or reclaim spaces to find hope, sometimes that actually does more harm than good, I think.
Yeah, I'm just sitting with what you're saying. So like this, the last sentence in this article is from you, Travis, and it kind of speaks to what you were just saying about if dominant systems are too often the thieves of hope, perhaps conversations committed to justice doing, however imperfect they may be, are one potential antidote. What I like about that sentence is the humility of it. Like it's just a potential antidote. We're not the answer, you know? And I like that, refusing to be situated that we have to have the answer to these things, but our resistance is important in terms of keeping us connected to, I think, humanity, and the resistance against oppression. So I really liked that, just like just the possibility of justice doing conversation, you know, bringing home.
Yeah, and Riel, I think, addressed this more eloquently, to be honest, earlier. But you know, when we think of the work we're doing as neutral, or that sheerly an empathic endeavor, right, and that justice isn't a part of it, that for me, because believe me, that's how I was trained.
Yeah.
That became a hopeless practice.
Yeah.
Because when issues of justice were not addressed, the work I was involved in kept coming up short, you know, and for a while there, I couldn't figure out why. You know, I thought, like, I think I'm executing what I'm supposed to be executing reasonably well. What the hell is the problem? Well, one of the major problems was that justice wasn't thought of, right? It you know, somehow the work of psychology and psychiatry was intrinsically just. If you just executed it, it was just on its own. You know, I'm thinking of a classroom experience I had where we were doing cognitive assessment, and this was before you could have everything online. It was like 2005 or something. And we were talking about the MMPI and some of these intelligence tests, both cognitive and personality assessments. And you can imagine I might have had a few critiques, and I had some research under my arm, and I talked about the way in which these tests were found to be culturally biased, to which the professor said to me, Travis, just because a test isn't culturally neutral doesn't make it culturally biased. It was a great silencing tactic, because it took me a few minutes to think about this shit. And then I was like, a few minutes later, I was like, no, actually, that's exactly what that means. Like, if something is not neutral, it is biased in some direction. And basically what the professor said was, I'm sorry, we've moved on, right? And we're done. But this is the way that sort of psychiatry and psychology have traditionally functioned, right? That just their existence and maintaining a space of neutrality is a justice doing practice. And I think probably all of us here disagree with that, right? But it's so embedded in the water supply of psychology and psychiatry that for however long they've been around, it seems most involved in it haven't thought to challenge it.
Yeah. But what you're saying really ties back to the language, Riel, that you use, that it re-justifies itself. You know, that the Canadian, I think you were using in the concept, the Canadian state is re-justifying itself. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about how psychology is using the same tactics, right, to re-justify itself, right? Yeah. Riel, I'm wondering what any kind of thoughts you're having at this moment about it, any of this.
Well, I think that what I'm thinking about is, well, lots of things, but what I'll share is when I was reading the piece, two things really stood out for me that I wanted to highlight. One was, Vikki, your work with people on death row, and you use the language of accompaniment, like that it mattered to these people that you were there, and that you represented and symbolized their connection to humanity. Like the fact that you were present was their connection to humanity while they were being subjected to such institutional dehumanization. And that your presence as a symbol of their connection to humanity was a place of hope amidst, you know, this violent, institutionalized well, the state violence, you talk about it. So I'm curious to hear some from you about that experience, or anything you'd like to share with me and Travis about that.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I just got really sad when you said that, thinking about these guys. I worked for over 20 guys. They were all executed. They're all long gone. And I often, this thing I learned from death row work being with these men was that everybody is so much more than the worst thing you've ever done. That's a truism from death penalty activism, that everybody is so much more than the worst thing you've ever done. So everybody, I think I got a lot of support or care that was not very supportive or caring. Basically it was a critique that I had kind of wasted a decade of my life because the 20 men I worked for, they all got executed like I was some kind of loser. And I think getting out of that, I just think I'm kind of oriented towards Marxism and shit, but getting out of that capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal idea that there's winners and losers in social justice battles, we are always going to be the losers. So that's not the game I'm playing. It's not a fucking competitive sport. For me, I was involved to keep my own humanity, I thought that resisting the states deciding that they could execute human beings, I thought it was the most dramatic thing they could do that was wrong. And I just thought, that's my struggle then. That's my connection. I also come from poor people who've been criminalized. So yeah, for me, I don't get to decide whether or not the person's going to get executed, but I do get to decide how I'm going to respond, which is I'm going to resist with everything I've got, try to change and bring down these systems. The prison industrial complex, everything Angela Davis was saying decades before I got involved. And just thinking about that, we didn't get to decide this person wasn't going to get killed, but it changes the way you face death when you're being treated like a human being by somebody, that someone's maintaining a connection of humanity. And it's interesting because, in terms of vicarious resistance, these are the guys that made it. I wasn't a therapist when I was doing this. These are the guys who made it possible for me to actually believe that I could do therapy, because I realized I don't need to win all the time. I just need to stay human and be in resistance and be alongside people and witness them as human beings. Travis, that kind of ties into what you're saying, is like not having the answers to these questions. I don't let not having the answers bother me at all. I am just going to continue to resist these structures of oppression. And so, so I think instead of burning me out or causing me vicarious resistance, these guys are the reason I'm able to do my work. I carry them with me all the time, not as a burden, not as any of that trauma language. They're not part of my, they're not intrusive thoughts. They accompany me, and I'm resisting their execution by keeping them alive. And I've got a quote from one of those guys in my really busy office right here, right behind me that you can't see. And sometimes people tell me it's a bit dark for me to have someone's last words from death row on my wall. And I'm like, you know what? He's gone and I'm still here. And this is how I'm staying human. Michael Franti says, stay human. This is how this is for me. And Roger Coleman was actually innocent. He got executed in the state of Virginia. They actually went to the Supreme Court and won a case called the right to execute the innocent. And they knew that that it would get overturned. So they killed him really quickly as soon as they got that. They also killed Herrera in Texas at the same time. But anyway, Roger Coleman was innocent. And I wasn't working for guys because they were innocent. I was working for them because I thought they were human beings and we shouldn't be killing human beings. But Roger Coleman, even though he was innocent, his last words were not about him. His last words weren't, you're killing an innocent man. That's not the last thing he said to the governor of Virginia. He said, a battle's been lost, but the war goes on. Don't give up hope. And never, never quit fighting. The insanity called the death penalty will end someday. So stay strong and keep the faith. So I have Roger's words up on my wall, so I keep faith with him. There's a part of Roger that still, they can kill, like, I learned this from these guys on death row, and it made me useful to survivors of torture. So when I'm working with survivors of torture, where so many of their friends were murdered, I realized, you know, part of our resistance is the state can kill people, and we can't always stop that, though we should try. But they don't get to sever our relationships with people, right? And so our resistance to that murder, my resistance to Roger's execution, is to continue to quote him like he's a friend of mine, like this is the wisdom we need, right? And I think about Bauman, this survivor of torture that I wrote an article with called Poetic Resistance. Bauman's resistance to political violence and suffering. He had a best friend who had been murdered by the state. They executed him, they assassinated him in jail. And what happened is the assassination, the execution was so horrific that Bauman could never think of his friend, because it just had this quote, as Janae would say, it was the idea fixe. He just had this total traumatic response. So what had happened is, because of that quote trauma, which we would just see as oppression, Bauman was unable to continue his relationship with his friend who was murdered by the state. So what we did in the stuff that I agree, Travis, is not therapy. It was, I think of it as political witnessing. What we did in collaboration with each other is found another way for Bauman to be able to be reconnected with his murdered friend so that he could still have him in his life and in his heart and his relationship. And I think that, and that was great therapeutic work. That's really helped a lot of people. That is not my work. That came from guys on death row. You know, and so it's interesting, people think that death row cost me so much. It has built my knowledge. I mean, these collaborations have been amazing. You know, this is the stuff of vicarious resistance, right? I'm getting energized as I speak about all these like horrific, horrible events and people being like murdered and executed by the state. But I hold my heartbreak and my rage in this tension with this like amazing resistance that continues to make me more useful and have people's lives and their resistance matter long after the state has killed them. Like the state doesn't get to win everything, right? So I don't know.
Well, and that brings up the powerful active knowledge keepers and elders and people in Indigenous communities who are making the journey to those residential schools to bring back the remains of the children who never made it home because they were killed at the residential school and placed in unmarked graves. That the power of bringing them home to their territories, I think, speaks to and resonates deeply culturally, collectively with that knowledge you're articulating too in your sites of struggle, Vikki, that that one of the most powerful acts of resistance against colonialism and genocide and capitalism and racism is to maintain our connections to our humanity, you know. And Travis, I was very moved when I read your piece about the work that you had done with the fellow who came to see you after he had served in the military. And I was coming here today to our talk really hoping that you would speak to that work and what you experienced in that transformative moment, just as, you know, Vikki honored us with her experience too. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Riel. I've worked with a decent number of people who have been, you know, involved in combat within the wars that the United States has, you know, been a part of and often, you know, instigated and perpetrated. And that the first thing for me, that's a struggle because I already have some moral opposition to the way in which the military industrial complex is functioning, right? But when I'm working with a person who's suffering as a result of being a part of that, one way that I've found I'm able to help myself be present for them and perhaps find some hope is to separate them from these larger systems. I mean, in the case of Julio, who was I was speaking with, he, you know, his family was very poor and didn't have much money, and so the military was like a way out of that, right? Now we could talk about the politics of how it is that mostly poor folks are fighting the wars, right? While the people making the policies, their kids aren't going to wars. But, you know, I get that's a separate deal to a certain extent. But, you know, and also the way that, you know, I remember him talking about playing video games, like Call of Duty video games, and like those, and that, you know, he was gonna be a hero, right? This is what he was going to do. And then, of course, went there and found out that it was a lot different than the stories that he had been sold. But then he's in there, and what is he supposed to do? And I remember him telling me stories about like how he would resist, you know, people with more power than him. I don't know all the ranks and stuff, but people with more power than him would make a mandate that he was supposed to do something. And he would find sort of clever ways to resist that, you know. Now you can't just like outwardly decline, because you go to prison, right? I don't know the fancy language about, but you know, and then there's supposed to be these laws where if someone with higher rank is asking you to do something that's against the policy, but that's bullshit. Like, he had seen that happen, and it doesn't get enforced in a fair way. And so what I most admired about Julio is he found ways to resist this that were clever, that wouldn't get him in trouble, but would still resist it, right? Now, within all of this, there were tragedies that he was a part of. And he left just feeling that he was basically a piece of shit. Like, look at these horrible things that I had done. And the way that I conceptualized it was like, no, look at these sort of horrible things that you were forced to do. Now, I didn't use that language with him per se, but in my head, it was like, no, you're not a horrible person, right? You've been a part of this larger system that's mandated that you do horrible things. And that if you don't, there are horrible consequences for you to face. You're put in this horrible catch-22, right? And he's not the first person that's been involved in United States military that I've had these kind of conversations with, to tease out, you know, who's the culprit here. And of course, in our culture in the United States, it's hyper individualist. So everything's a personal responsibility, which is a little bizarre, because the longer I live, the more I've, even coming up in this very individualist culture, the more I've started to wonder how much responsibility is ever personal. You know, like the longer I live and the more experience I have, it seems more and more to be collective in almost every instance. And so for me, what I was trying to do there, and if I can do this even with a small degree of success, I found that it could be helpful, is separate him from this system that he was a part. Because even if I would bring this up, he'd be, well, it was my decision to enroll in the military. So I guess, but was it though? Like, was it your decision, or were there these sort of pressure points around you that are guiding you that direction? Now, I can't, you know, if I speak in this fucking over intellectual way, that's not helpful, right? It's usually not helpful. So what I have to try to do is find a way to ask questions that can hopefully help the person begin to see this in their own way, right? Rather than in some over intellectualized way, or for the person to tell me I'm full of shit. Maybe I am, you know, maybe I'm going down the wrong road, and that's perfectly okay. They can tell me that too. But I found what usually happens is it takes a little metabolizing, like time to metabolize. But then when it hits, there's this feeling of at least some degree of liberation, of like, okay, like I actually am that person that I always thought I was, which is a good person that's trying to do their best in the world, right? Which I think is what all of us are trying to do. That's trying to do well by his family and his community. Like, that's what this was really about, you know. But it got taken a different direction because of the horrors of the military and war.
Thanks so much for that. Look, I think we're good here. I really appreciate the conversation that we had today. I want to thank you again for writing alongside me in very separate ways and not conflating. As America Bracto says, you know, we don't ever want to inflate, we never want to annihilate our really important differences. We come to this work and this conversation really differently, and I think that's super important. But I felt very accompanied by you, and your solidarity really matters to me. So I want to really thank you for this conversation as well.
I just want to say thanks for letting me be a part of it, and Riel, was great to be in conversation with you and continue to learn from you. And Vikki, we've been in conversation before. It's great to continue to learn from you. And I can already feel the conversation. I don't know if y'all have a similar experience, but like it's doing something in my body. I don't know what it is. Like check back with me in a few weeks, but I can feel it doing something, doing some things probably. And that's usually for me the sign that like something important's happening. And so thanks for letting me be in conversation and continue to learn from both of you.
Great, thanks, Travis. It was an honor to witness what you share and be in conversation with you too. And Vikki, yeah, the relationship that we've been building over years is just deeply meaningful for me too. So I want to honor that and thank you for what you shared on my relations.
Great. Okay, I think I stopped recording that. Well,
It's still recording.
is it?